Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Disaster Recovery and Build Back Better. My name is Ram Satish Pasupuleti. I am working as Assistant Professor in Department of Architecture and Planning, IIT Roorkee. Today I am going to discuss about two important concepts of DRR, which is disaster risk reduction, and these two includes CAM and CBDRM. CAM is Community Asset Management, and the second one is CBD, Community Based Disaster Risk Management. So before we talk about these CAM and CBDRM, I think I'll try to explain you what are the complexities within the system and the hierarchies on these different networks, the institutional networks, and what are the kind of constraints on coordination and planning of a disaster recovery. Because when we talk about disaster recovery, there are a lot of agencies comes into the picture, especially even if you take the system of UN, United Nations. So there have been a number of bodies coming in, but how they are actually classified and how they are linked with each other, how they are hierarchical to each other, and how their governing bodies work within each other. So let's see how it has been done. Max Lock Center, where I worked earlier as part of my research, and they have published a document on Mind the Gap, post-disaster reconstruction and the transition from humanitarian relief. So in that monograph, the Max Lock Center, Tony Lloyd Jones and his team, they have developed this kind of the network of what happens in UN and what are the various different bodies. And so let's see, I will explain you this kind of institutional complexity within the UN disaster response system. So one is you have the higher body of the UN General Assembly, and which is further divided into International Strategy of Disaster Risk Reduction, ISDR, and in which we have the Interagency Task Force for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the UN ISDR, which is the Interagency Secretarial for the ISDR. So these two formulates the ISDR, and then you have the coordination of humanitarian policy development and the humanitarian advocacy. So within which we have the UN agencies of UNESD, which is the Economic and Social Development, and UN DESA, Economic and Social Affairs, and DESC, Support and Coordination to ECHO SDC, and UNDAW, Advancement of Women, and UNCRD, Regional Development. So like that, is number of agencies part of it. And then you have the Central Register and OCHA, which is an important aspect, the Office of the Coordination of the Humanitarian Affairs. So it is related with the Central Register, Emergency Telecommunications, and the Emergency and Relief Coordinator. So this part is an important office, and that is where it springs into Interagency Standing Committee, which is an early recovery cluster, as well as the civil, military and coordination, because this particular IASC, which is talking about the early recovery, obviously military comes into the picture. So that is where the civil military coordination section. And from the ISDR, it goes to it conducts the program of WCDR, which is the World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, and the IDD, Interagency of Internal Displacement Division. So these are the UN agencies, which you can see that the one is UNDP, United Nations Development Program, which talks about the crisis prevention and recovery, disaster management program, and drylands development center, and UN Habitat. The moment habitat comes into the picture, it is more to do with the shelter. So shelter and sustainable human settlements and the disaster management program. Then it talks about the WHO, World Health Organization, which is more to do with the health action in crisis, like stopping the endemic and epidemic diseases, and as well as how to approach the health situation in the crisis and emergency situation. And FAO, which is the farming, livestock, fisheries, and the forestry, which is also the global information and early warning system. So it talks about the livelihood and the nature related livelihood aspects. And World Food Program, because we are talking about the malnutrition, we are talking about the poverty in developing countries. So that is where the world's food program is also an important aspect, and how we can give the food security in the event of crisis. UNEP, which is more to do with the environmental issues in disaster management. So that is where it talks about early warning as an assessment, information database, and emergencies at a local level as well. So UNICEF, which is more to do with the health, education, equality, and protection of children in disasters. So UNICEF also plays an important role, how they take care of the children who have been affected by the disasters, and how they can give kind of health, education, and as well as the protection for them. And UNESCO, which is the prevention strategy and global early warning system and impact assessment. And it also talks about the cultural framework for these communities, affected communities, and how also the important sites, the heritage sites, which have been affected in the disasters. And UNHC, which is talking about the human rights of displaced people, whether in the form of refugees, whether in the form of people who have been displaced due to war or any disaster. So what kind of human rights? This is where the UNHC works out. And as I discussed with here, and this is where the information system, whether it is Relief Web or the humanitarianinfo.org or the glide number, the virtual OSOCC number, which is actually a set of information system, what is happening, what recovery programs are going on, which NGOs are working. So it brings a huge database. And this is where we also talk about the UNDMTP, which is about the disaster management training and program. So this is again very much linked with the UNDP aspect. And then once we have the information systems, one you have the governing bodies, one you have the UN agencies, one you have the strategy, ISDR. So that is how one is looking at the management process of it and the information, and one is looking at the international strategy, ISDR, which is the disaster reduction program. And this is more of the coordination of humanitarian policy development and humanitarian advocacy. So here we see the rapid assessment and international coordination on site. This is where United Nations assessment and coordination. So they look at the search and rescue, and the INSARG, which is the International Search and Rescue Advisory Group. So in the event of an disaster, and immediately the search process and how they have to follow up on it and what kind of mechanisms they have to follow, this whole rescue and advisory group will work on it. And this is where the UNDAC works on the rapid assessment and international coordination on site. And this is further linked up with the IRIN, which is a news and the broadcasting service. And this is where again it is communicating to the UN regional agencies, whether it is UNECA Africa, CEPAL, which is Latin America, UNHCR Europe, and UNESCAP ASEAN Pacific, and UNSC Western Africa, so Western Asia, sorry. So this is how this whole complexity in the UN disaster response system has been laid out, and how different bodies have their own individual tasks, and as well as certain overlaps do existed within these agencies. In fact, and this system, when it gets connected to the national governments or the state level parties, that is where even more complex situations works, because on the political, they are directly linked with the political system of a particular nation or a country, which might be pressurized in a different situation. The priorities are very different. So that is where Paul Oliver and Isan Urbaslive, they actually commented on how the perceptions of the recovery process, they are not the same among those who are administering the recovery and those who are the recipients. So one is a provider and one is a taker, So both the perceptions are very different. For the agencies, whether it's a government or voluntary organizations who administer assistance, for them the important tools are efficiency and the speed. How many houses we can dwell, how many livelihoods we can generate, how to generate, how efficiently we can generate. So these are the prime considerations and attitudes and customs which tend to impede these priorities or deployed. Whereas the recipients, on the other hand, both the disaster and its aftermath or disruptions in the flow of their lives. For instance, the recipients who have lost their boats in the tsunami, for them the immediate life and need is getting back to the normalcy, getting back to their livelihood. So also how to retain their customs and practices. So in fact, this is where in flow of their lives and desire to retain customs and practices and behavior patterns, which ensure measure of stability, even if they are a hindrance of effective external relief, is of great importance. So this is where how the recipient looks at, because maybe in the immediate impact of a disaster, he might look for an immediate shelter, immediate need, but in a longer run, the perception changes because he need to have a balance on his customs and his way of life. And that is where one has to look at, what the relief culture has to look at, what the recipient culture is expecting also, not only in the immediate term, but in the long run aspects. And in order to address this gap and the differences between the providers and the recipients, or the administrators and the recipients, so I'll try to introduce you in this talk two terminologies. One is CAM, which is the community asset management, and we also refer to CAM. It is the management of physical assets in collective use by urban or rural populations. So this brings the management. So these are the physical assets, whether it is in the form of buildings, whether in the form of infrastructure, whether in the form of any livelihood stock. So how collectively they are able to access, whether it is an urban or rural population. And it actually CAM envisages the improved capacity of low income communities, because in developing countries, the poverty aspect is one of the holding factor for any kind of vulnerability setup. So how their livelihood aspect is directly related to the access to their capacities. For the management of life cycle planning, so it is not about only we are dealing with the situation itself, we have to look at how the continuity works out in a life cycle planning approach, because it is not just you lost something, I gave you something and you are done. So it has to be continuity, you have to bring that continuity aspect in it. A regular care and construction work for new and existing community buildings. So this is where the physical assets are continuously maintained and taken further with a life cycle planning approach. The capacity building can be taken in few steps. One is the identification of assets and their condition. So here one is the few points which has been listed, and both the references of Mind the Gap and as well as the CBDRM approach, which was listed by John Twigg, and disaster risk reduction. So they talk about listing the experiences and analyzing the skills of the community to manage and implement any repair and maintenance program. So do they have any skills? Do they have any operational tools or methods? How they approach and tackle a particular disaster, and how they can actually able to approach a certain livelihood aspect. generating awareness and capacity building regarding asset management in the community as well as local authorities. So one is we are talking about the awareness and capacity building program. So it's not only with the community but also with the local authorities where the community is directly relevant to. Physical survey and identification of community assets to be repaired and upgraded through discussion with local community. What is relevant to the community? How one can able to, because you need to engage the community in this discussion so that they can identify what is relevant to them and they can identify how to work on it, how they can even put some efforts and funds possibly to make it better, or at least they can liaison with some other funding agencies. So there are various ways how a dialogue can happen. Orientation of the stakeholders. So presenting the task of repair and recovery to different target audiences such as policymakers, administrators, accountants, community masons, engineers and building center managers and supervisors. So if one can be able to present this outcome, these are the list of the buildings we have identified that could be repaired further. These are the areas which we can construct for a new purpose. So once this whole task has been presented to the stakeholder, not only the community but the local authorities, but the policymakers, but the administrators, and as well as if there is any building centers and their authorities and their supervisors on the mason groups. So in that way there should be a collaboration you can actually, and you can have to orient them for that kind of collaboration. Capacity building for technical group. In fact, this is very important because day to day the technology is changing and in fact the task of the construction is also, it's changing for every 2-3 years. The new technology is coming up, new challenges are coming up, new regulatory frameworks are coming up in the market and also in the system. So that is where one has to look at the specialist training programs conducted for supervisors, and it can also talk about basic housekeeping and minor repairs, bookkeeping, site management, quality control, procurement of materials and manpower management. So how efficiently one can do it. So this is all to do with the kind of local level approaches, and even a small, if you are training a local mason near a village, but if you can actually train with this whole process, the file keeping and the bookkeeping, so that there is an accountable, he will be accountable and he will maintain the transparency in his work. So that will be very much useful, that makes his technical skill better and better, and it could be even validated. Condition survey of assets. So how physical inspection, and also one can make an inventory and determining the priorities. What is the first priority, because you only have a limited fund. How you can prioritize the set of activities, and analysis of distress and recommendations. So this is where the analysis plays an important role. You have 100 buildings damaged in the locality which need restoration or reconstruction. So which one, you have only a few $1 million to work on it. So then what is the first task to work? Which are the most priority? Is it you start with a home, or you start with a livelihood, you start with a religion? That's priority has to be understood. Then preparing estimates of works and comparative cost benefit of repair, because the economics play an important role in making a decision making. Planning for the procurement of materials and labor. How do you procure labor? Because these particular labor, especially in a distressed conditions, you may not be able to access the materials as well, depending on the feasibilities of the available materials, or you may not even get the labor, appropriate labor. So how we can coordinate it, because everything has to be cost effective. Analysis of the distress and recommendations. So that is where it talks about the situations. Preparing estimations for works and comparative and planning of the procurement of materials and labor. Then the demonstrations. Demonstration of the community asset management at key sites, which can ensure the stakeholders are equipped with the right skills and shared understanding before the real building is scaled up. So Once you have done the survey, when you have done the event inventories, and based on that analysis, you have prioritized the task, you have recommended certain program to it, and which could be scheduled in action. And this is where you need to demonstrate at important sites, whether it is a site to be constructed or whether it is a local authority, whether it is a funding agency. You need to make sure that that all the training programs have been conducted so that we are ready to go for the rebuilding. So we have just tested one model, and then how we can scale this up. So this is how the community asset management talks about. Similarly, John Twigg also refers to the CBDRM projects, which is the community-based disaster risk management projects. He gives an example of community risk management of Gestão de Risco Anual da Comunidade, so which is Gerando method in Mozambique, which has been designed by World Vision in collaboration with Equador Mondal University, which has piloted over 30 projects from 2006 to 2000. For about 4 years, they have scaled up to 30 projects using this CBDRM method. What is Gerando? Gerando is a process for supporting local capacities to identify, predict, manage hazard impacts. So this process consists of 6 interrelated stages, which I'll explain briefly about it, and which has been facilitated by a trained member of the local community. So the first aspect is establish a local DRM committee in each community. So you have a community, and then you try to make sure that you set up a DRM committee, the Disaster Risk Management Committee, in each community. So the Gerando facilitator is usually the community coordinator, who then leads the community through the next 5 steps. So one is set up and identify the significant shocks and stress that community faces. Is it due to drought? Is it famine? Is it war? Is it one has to identify that. So this is he's the one who actually coordinates with the rest of the community and carry out vulnerability and capacity assessment. So this is where he talks about what kind of degree of vulnerability we do have and what is the priority. This is because this is where one has to understand the analysis part of it. Identify the scientific and traditional or indigenous early warning indicators. So one has to understand that what kind of early warning systems we have, so that how we can inform these to the community. And this is where the 5th step is develop and implement mitigation plans. Where appropriate, draw up a community disaster preparedness plan. So once if you know what is the shock, what is the stress the community is put upon, and one can understand the vulnerability and the capacity assessment, and one can identify what are the scientific and traditional or indigenous early warning indicators, so that they can understand and implement mitigation plans, because each one is connected to, and then that is where one can end up draw up a community level disaster preparedness plan. So this is a kind of website of Mozambique. There's a lot of projects on starting from disability and victims of floods and cyclone Idai, and that children victims. There's a lot of programs within it. And one of the important challenge is official disaster management organizations they tend to undervalue the potential of informal social organization or network, whether it is a neighborhood or families or kinship groups. So in the earlier stage, this community could be some places it is very small, but the official processes they try to undervalue this. And actions by the affected communities or groups, example search and rescue, given out food and water, have been viewed as irrelevant. So even the way the communities support each other, they often tend to ignore or trash these things, and irrelevant or disruptive because they are not directed by the authorities, because they are not officially directed. So that is where most of the official setup overlooks this existing community networks, the indigenous networks, how they cooperate, how they face the disaster, how they understand the disaster. For an effective CBRDM, one need to understand there's a social capital which plays an important role. The term social capital, if you refer to Putnam's work on, it says the social resources which people draw upon to pursue their objectives. These comprise networks and connections between individuals, membership of groups, and relationships of trust and exchange. It could be a horizontal capital, it could be a vertical capital, it could be a network within a group, it could be across groups. One has to understand, when you are in a crisis, it actually brings people together and stimulates stronger and lasting social connectedness. So this is, a crisis also gives an opportunity to bring people together. Inclusion and expectations, and that is where the participator, whom to include, how to include, and because they have all different expectations, and this is where the participatory methods play an important role. If you are talking about participation, that there is also a note of successful 3 T's. The first T talks about the transparency, which requires clarity, openness, accountability, and it respects the need for communities to be informed about the drawbacks of interventions as well as their benefits. Time. The second aspect is time. It is needed to build meaningful relationships between communities, outsiders, and the intermediate, the in between, to implement activities and to enable communities to take ownership of the process. The trust. It is the result of transparency and the time in the participatory process, creating a sense of shared effort, goals, and responsibility. So this too will obviously build a trust between the communities, between, once you are transparent, once you make things transparent, accountable, meaningful, with clarity, and that is where you will definitely build a relationship between communities and outsider and the intermediaries, and also it can enable you to take the ownership of the process, and that eventually it will build a trust. But the question is it practical to involve everyone all the time in CBRDM activities? This is very difficult question. This is very difficult to ask for any NGO to address that. Some of the key tools involving the most vulnerable. So who are all affected, who are frequently targeted, or who are under threat, try to involve them as much as possible. That is one of the important steps. Bring the information and openness. You have to be transparent. Bring what the decision making process, how it is done, how this has been developed, and what kind of strategy they are going to implement. So bring it more transparent ways. In any community, there are always a power relations. One is have and have nots, power and powerful, powerless and powerful. So even across the communities, it is not just only addressing the person who already have certain power aspect, but you also have to address who is not having any power. So you have to bring them into the consensus. The insiders and outsiders. So how an outsider can actually come and interact with the insider, because one has to build a trust, and that is where local authorities, local agencies, whether it is a church, whether it is a municipal authority, how they play a vital role in bringing an interaction between an insider and outsider. So how to facilitate the CBDRM? The entry points. An international NGO, when they try to approach the community, it was very difficult to work with the community because both are from different cultures and different power setups and different targets and different expectations. So creating an entry point, this is where, as I said to you, the local authorities have to play an important role. How one can able to bridge partnerships between these the agencies which are coming to help them and which the beneficiaries who are going to work with them. even when in my own case, when I went to some villages in Tamil Nadu, they were not trusting me because I was considered as an outsider. So what I did was I went to the church and I met the father, and the father introduced me that I am doing research on these communities in tsunami affected. And then from next day onwards, people started cooperating with me. So that cooperation, and in the longer run, I developed some trust. So coming to the process and methods, we talk about the participatory learning PLA and action methods and tools. One is the spatial, which is talking about the mapping and modeling. This is very useful in risk and vulnerability assessment. It can be used to identify hazards and dangerous locations. What community already know about these? The identify areas affected by erosion, loss of vegetation or pest infestation, and identify vulnerable groups and capacities and assets within the community. So how you can address that in the spatial mapping and the modeling, whether it is a hydrological modeling, whether it is a remote sensing aspects. So whatever the tools we are using, but we need to understand the spatial understanding of the vulnerability. The second aspect is the nominal, which is the collecting, naming or listing. It can collect information about communities and their environment, like for instance, we are talking about who are the beneficiaries, what kind of crops they have lost, how much. And it can also look at the sequencing, the coping strategies used in times of food crisis, health problems in order of frequency or importance, and also the associated reasons for it, such consequences and deforestation. The temporal, so putting all these events in a sequence, whether it is through personal and ecological histories, disaster timelines, disaster visualization, seasonal calendars, community timelines, or reenacting events, because these methods will actually reveal the changing nature of vulnerability. If you look at a historical record of any disaster and its impact, one can see where we are progressing, how it is actually heading to, so that we can effectively look after those preparedness aspects, what went wrong, so that we can look for an alternative mechanisms. Ordinal, when we say ordinal, sorting and comparing and ranking, because this is where we can identify the most vulnerable individuals and households. Numerical, which is talking on most of the economic aspect of it, counting, estimating, comparing and scoring. And methods of this kind could be used in assessing disaster losses and which normally any of the district agency is going to do on this. How much of the livelihood stock has been damaged? How much of the animals have been killed? This is how mostly they are narrowing down to numbers. Relational. This is often related to how we link and how we relate, how different facilitators understand that how different parts of the community relate to one another, and how they identify the power structures. And because it can associate of one cause with another impact and one impact with another reason of it. So in that way, the effects of drought might be linked to a land tenure arrangements or to gender-based divisions of labor using a problem tree. So it's all about a very complex phenomenon of A is linking to B and B is linking to C, C is linking to D, but D is again linking to A. This kind of problem tree could be developed. In fact, one of the important challenges how to integrate this CBDRM with official development planning. There's a good case which they've given about Bandari and Malakkar's work on Nepal, where in the districts of Chitwal and Nawalparasi in Nepal, there's a practical action group was working in 59 village development development committees, and which are the lowest administrative units of government. So you have these VDCs, village development committees, to prepare the DRM. So they will prepare the DRM plans, and then the ward and community level vulnerability assessments were carried out in each VDC. So there is again ward level assessments has been carried out in each VDC, and then this is where they form the local DRM planning workshops. Okay, so with representative government, civil society, organizations as well as technical experts. And then these are agreed and the final plans with various endorsed by the respective VDCs plus municipal councils in the local development plans. This is where the local development plans, and then these are further developed into DDPs, DDCs, district development committees for inclusion into the district development plans. So this is how from a local vulnerability assessments this has been identified at the district level aspect. So this is branching out from a small segment to a district level is a very important aspect. So what are the features of the successful CBDR? How do we measure it? Of course, the IFRC, the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies have actually looked at the 9 key determinants of a successful community-based DRR program. The motivation and capacity of the community and community leaders, so how it has motivated the community. And the motivation and capacity of the Red Cross, Red Crescent stakeholders and the strength of partnerships between them. So what kind of partnerships it has established. The capacity of external actors, NGOs and private sector and the strength of the partnerships with them. The level of community participation and ownership of CBDRM program. The level of integration with other sectors. So we are not only talking about the ownership, but we're also talking about the integration, how well they are coordinating with. Having an appropriate balance with standardization and flexibility in the program design. And also having sufficient time to implement CBDRM program, because these are a very much time taking process. And having sufficient funding implementing the CBDR program, so how we can generate funding is also an important term. Having adequate assessment, monitoring and evaluation procedures, so which goes back again to have a continuity cycle of how periodically one can assess this. So I hope you got about an idea of what is CBDRM and the community asset management. I think this will help you. Thank you.